April 23, 1945. The war in Europe was a dying beast, tearing itself apart from within. Cities lay engulfed in flames, their once proud skylines shattered, while roads were choked with a desperate tide of refugees and the ragged remnants of retreating armies. The Third Reich, once a symbol of unyielding arrogance, had been reduced to nothing more than smoldering fragments and whispered fears. Through the ravaged landscape of Saxony, the 69th Infantry Division pushed forward, their advance a grim testament to weary, unyielding determination. Their rifles were slung low, yet every man's nerves were stretched taut, an invisible wire thrumming with constant apprehension. Each elongated shadow held the specter of a hidden sniper. Every seemingly innocuous farmhouse, a potential deadly trap. For countless days, the soldiers had traversed an endless tableau of devastation. Charred wagons, bridges twisted into grotesque ruins, and towns where even the church bells seemed to have fallen silent, their voices stifled by a collective mourning. They were hardened veterans now, their senses dulled by the constant presence of roadside corpses, the acrid scent of death a permanent thread woven into the otherwise fresh spring air. Yet, even their battle-scarred minds could not have braced them for the appalling discovery that awaited them outside Leipzig that fateful morning. Beyond a low, unassuming ridge, concealed by rusted barbed wire and the skeletal frames of sagging watchtowers, lay a compound. It bore all the unmistakable hallmarks of a labor camp, its guard posts abandoned, its barracks leaning against one another like a group of exhausted, broken men. The oppressive stench of decay hung heavy in the spring breeze, a foul promise of what was within. The American soldiers advanced with extreme caution, every muscle tensed, anticipating landmines or a final, desperate ambush. The lieutenant raised a hand, a silent command for absolute quiet, and they pushed forward, bayonets glinting grimly in the pale morning light. At the compound's desolate center stood a barn-like structure, its single door incongruously marked with a faded red curtain. Some men speculated it was a hidden supply cache. Others, in a grim attempt at gallows humor, joked darkly about yet another slaughterhouse. One private mumbled, "If it's just more dead cows, I swear I'm turning vegetarian." The nervous, hollow laughter that followed quickly evaporated as they cautiously pried open the door. Inside, the air hung thick and cloying, heavy with the scent of perfume gone rancid, mingling with smoke that lingered like unspoken, ancient secrets. The room was tightly lined with narrow beds, their thin mattresses stained and sagging, each corner draped with meager curtains meant to feign a semblance of privacy. And on these beds, arranged in an eerie, unsettling silence, sat women. Dozens of them, all heartbreakingly young, none appearing older than 25, some barely beyond adolescence. Their faces were powdered, their lips painted, but the makeup was cracked and streaked, a mask of despair ruined by tears and profound exhaustion. They regarded the Americans not with a flicker of hope, but with palpable dread, as if the sight of uniforms simply portended another cycle of violation. One woman instinctively pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around herself. Another cast her gaze downwards, unwilling or unable to meet their eyes. The American soldiers froze, their expectations shattered. They had anticipated finding prisoners in striped uniforms, skeletal men gasping for a breath of freedom. Instead, they were confronted by women dressed, impossibly, for seduction, yet clearly starved, their very beauty weaponized and twisted against their will. The stark, horrific contrast was almost unbearable to comprehend. Sergeant Robert Hayes, a Midwestern farm boy whose calloused hands had once milked cows at the first hint of dawn, whispered, his voice hoarse, "My God, they're not prisoners. They're hostages." His words hung suspended in the heavy air, a chilling clarity cutting through the soldiers' confusion, articulating what everyone had sensed instinctively, but could scarcely yet comprehend. The lieutenant immediately ordered his men to lower their rifles. He stepped forward slowly, hands open in a gesture of peace, his voice steady but profoundly gentle. "It's over. You're safe now." The words, haltingly translated by a Polish-American private who spoke a fractured Slavic, elicited no immediate reaction. These women had been so utterly conditioned by years of unremitting brutality that they had learned to expect all promises as cruel preludes to yet more pain. One young girl, perhaps no more than 17, tilted her head slightly and asked in a voice so fragile it seemed about to shatter, "How much do you pay me?" The translator faltered, his face etched with disbelief, before repeating her question aloud. A stunned, agonizing silence followed, broken only when one of the GIs muttered, his voice thick with emotion, "Nothing. We're not here for that. You're free." The word "free" seemed to hang in the air, foreign and incomprehensible. It sounded like a bizarre riddle, an unfamiliar, unsettling tune. Some of the women averted their gaze, unable to process the bewildering declaration. Others whispered nervously among themselves, deeply uncertain if this was truly liberation or merely the arrival of a new set of masters, albeit with different accents. One woman clutched a ragged, threadbare doll tightly to her chest, as if in doing so, she could remind herself that she was still human, still capable of love, still worthy of tenderness. The American soldiers, utterly untrained and unprepared for an encounter of this profound nature, fumbled awkwardly, torn between the rigid dictates of soldierly discipline and their raw, burgeoning human instinct. A medic carefully set down his kit, unwrapped a fresh bandage, and then, slowly, offered a crust of bread. The women hesitated, their eyes fixed on the food as if it were a dangerous lure. When the medic, sensing their profound distrust, tore off a piece and ate it himself before offering the remainder, one girl finally reached out with trembling fingers, her eyes welling with tears as she bit into real bread for the first time in what must have been months. That small, tender act of shared humanity broke the dam of their suppressed emotions. Immediately, others surged forward, a desperate, silent wave, clutching at the proffered loaves of bread and precious chocolate rations. The soldiers distributed the provisions, watching as tears streaked dark paths through the women's caked makeup. The men, hardened by months of relentless carnage, felt an unexpected, painful tightening in their throats. These were not nameless civilians glimpsed from a distance. These were individual women, each one a person who had been forced to live inside a brutal machine of exploitation, ordered to smile and feign desire while their very souls withered and died. Sergeant Hayes scribbled furiously in his journal later that night, attempting to process the day's horrors. The Germans, he wrote, had found a way to turn sin into paperwork. Ledgers stood by the door, recording names and numbers like livestock. And yet, these girls, broken as they were, still looked more alive than the SS men we buried today. It was starkly clear. This brothel was no isolated aberration, but rather an integral part of a meticulously designed system. Some of the Americans, even in their revulsion, couldn't help but recognize the chilling German efficiency at play. Rosters were pinned to the walls, meticulous lists of appointments scheduled with the precise regularity of train timetables. It was bureaucracy itself, pressed into the perverse service of dehumanization, where human flesh was accounted for and managed with the same cold calculation as munitions. The soldiers capable of reading German shook their heads, their disbelief profound. They even stamped the sheets. One of them remarked bitterly, his voice laced with disgust. The irony of it all stung deeply. A regime obsessed with racial purity and moral discipline had, in fact, engineered organized debasement on a terrifyingly industrial scale. Among the women, a deep-seated mistrust stubbornly lingered. Some refused to approach the Americans at all, convinced that once the initial, bewildering kindness wore off, the brutal, old demands would inevitably return. But slowly, tentatively, simple human gestures began to speak louder and more eloquently than any uniform. A GI thoughtfully removed his field jacket and gently draped it around the shoulders of a shivering woman. Another pulled out a worn photograph of his wife and children, silently showing it to one of the women, as if to prove, beyond words, that he was not there to inflict harm, but to forge a genuine human connection. In those small, tender moments, something profound began to shift. The oppressive silence of fear started to fracture, breaking into hesitant whispers of disbelief and dawning comprehension. Outside, the remainder of the camp lay desolate and abandoned, bearing ample evidence of a hurried, panicked flight by its German overseers. Yet the horrifying discovery inside that red curtain building weighed far heavier on the soldiers' souls than any burned-out barracks or empty watchtower. They had liberated entire towns, countless prisoners, even whole factories of forced laborers. But here, in this quiet, grim chamber, liberation was measured not in strategic gains or military objectives, but in the fragile, painstakingly slow restoration of human dignity, however tentatively. As the day began to wane, the Americans quickly organized transport for the women, summoning medics and a chaplain to assist. The women gathered their few, meager belongings, a tattered scarf, a tiny trinket, often nothing at all, moving with heartbreaking hesitancy toward the now open gates. Still, many cast fearful glances back, deeply unsure whether stepping out truly signified escape or merely another, perhaps worse, chapter in their seemingly endless captivity. For them, the very concept of freedom was too alien, too utterly foreign, to be trusted immediately. One young soldier, watching them shuffle forward, shook his head slowly and murmured almost to himself, "We thought we came here to end a war. Turns out we came here to prove kindness still exists." It was a sentiment so profoundly true that no one dared to argue with it. Yet, as dusk finally settled, casting long shadows, and the women were gently led beyond the barbed wire, a much deeper, more troubling question lingered in the evening air. Could mere compassion ever truly heal the grievous wounds that systematic cruelty had so deeply carved into their very souls? Could simple bread and fresh bandages possibly undo years of unimaginable degradation? The soldiers in their hearts did not know, and the women, in their brokenness, dared not yet believe it. Their harrowing story, they knew, was far from over. What awaited them beyond the camp gates was utterly uncertain, and perhaps even more terrifying than the known horrors they left behind. The faded red curtain at the brothel door swayed gently in the wind, a mute witness to the unspeakable horrors endured within and the fragile, tentative hope of something new. And as the last vestiges of light faded from the sky, one young woman paused at the threshold, turned back, and whispered something in her own tongue. They were words no soldier understood intellectually, yet all felt their profound weight deep in their bones. It was not gratitude, nor outright fear, but something undefinable, a dawning, terrifying shock of true freedom. The Americans soon grasped the horrifying truth. What they had uncovered was no isolated curiosity, no lone aberration tucked away in the ruins of collapsing Reich. Rather, it was a system meticulously planned, officially sanctioned, and carefully maintained by the regime. Reports from other advancing units soon confirmed the same chilling story. Camp brothels were scattered across occupied Europe, each operating under identical rules of cruelty subtly disguised as bureaucratic order. The discovery outside Leipzig, therefore, served as a grim window into a much wider, more insidious machine, one that had systematically turned women into mere numbers and their daily torment into a dehumanizing ritual. The soldiers methodically began piecing together the mounting evidence. They found rosters still posted on the walls, written in crisp, precise German script, detailing shifts like factory schedules. Women's names had been chillingly replaced by numbers, their nationalities reduced to cold, impersonal abbreviations. Some rooms still contained ledgers where guards had diligently stamped dates beside each entry, marking visits with the same detached precision one might use to record cattle feedings. To the battle-hardened Americans, there was something especially grotesque and unsettling in this meticulous clerical neatness. War, they knew, could be savage, but this was utterly cold, meticulously calculated. It was unequivocally no accident. In 1942, Heinrich Himmler himself had authorized the official creation of these camp brothels, intended, in the cold, bureaucratic language of the regime, to improve morale among certain prisoners and officers while simultaneously discouraging homosexuality. Yet, behind such sterile phrasing lay a truly brutal and unspeakable reality. Thousands of women had been cruelly dragged from their homes across Poland, Ukraine, France, the Netherlands, and even from distant lands like Korea and China. They were herded into desolate barracks and chillingly informed that their service now belonged, body and soul, to the Reich. A small, tragic number of these women had been cruelly deceived, lured by false promises of jobs as secretaries or cooks, only to find themselves brutally locked behind barbed wire and forced onto filthy straw mattresses. For the vast majority, however, there had been no choice whatsoever, only brutal coercion. One Ukrainian woman, later liberated at Buchenwald, would chillingly recall in her testimony, "They said we would help the wounded. But when the door closed, they handed me rouge and told me to smile. I had no words for that kind of betrayal." Another, from Poland, described the agonizing experience of standing in line, to be selected like mere livestock, her fate irrevocably sealed by a casual nod from a camp official. These harrowing accounts, painstakingly gathered decades later, chillingly confirmed what the soldiers had only glimpsed in that immediate, horrifying moment. A vast, meticulously organized machinery of exploitation, cunningly disguised by bureaucratic euphemism. The stark, hypocritical contrast was utterly impossible to miss. The Germans had endlessly preached a perverse ideology of racial purity and rigid moral discipline. Yet here was the rotten, festering core of their system. Hidden rooms where officers and privileged prisoners bought moments with women who possessed no ability whatsoever to refuse. American soldiers who stumbled upon these ghastly brothels often muttered the same bitter refrain, a disgusted dismissal of the enemy's pretense. So much for their so-called honor. One GI even scribbled in a letter home, his anger palpable, "If this is what they fought for, they've already lost." They truly lost before they even began. The environment inside these special blocks was a grotesque, perverse parody of normalcy. Thin curtains were hung in a futile attempt to feign privacy. Cheap, cloying perfume was distributed, its only purpose to mask the pervasive stench of disease. Makeup was rationed out, a cruel provision meant to ensure the illusion of willing smiles. The women were sometimes even instructed to dress in brightly colored skirts or blouses, scavenged from the belongings of deported civilians, as if such costumes could somehow obscure the brutal reality of their captivity. The Americans who entered these grim spaces described a profound, surreal dissonance. Lipstick found beside barbed wire, rouge smeared across faces hollowed by gnawing hunger. Medics painstakingly cataloged the horrific physical consequences with grim precision. Many of the women were infected with syphilis or gonorrhea. Some bore hideous scars, testaments to beatings endured when they dared to resist. A tragic number were pregnant, the fathers unknown or already lost to the chaos of the retreating Reich. One army doctor noted in his official report concerning the examined women, "Nearly all are severely malnourished, many chronically diseased. Their physical condition speaks unequivocally to prolonged, systemic neglect and severe abuse." Yet, even this cold, clinical phrasing could not begin to capture the quiet desperation, the silent tears in the women's eyes as they endured yet another examination. This time, crucially, under the fragile promise that it would not be followed by violence. The women themselves had been forced to live in a constant state of profound psychological dissonance. They were prisoners, yet inexplicably dressed up as willing companions. They were brutally forced to serve men, yet simultaneously stripped of any semblance of their own identity as women. Some spoke of being ordered to laugh, to flirt, to pretend at desire, all while a guard stood menacingly at the door with a loaded rifle. Others recalled the chilling, heavy silence afterward, the crushing weight of shame as suffocating as the physical chains they no longer wore. The psychological cruelty, they knew, rivaled the physical torment. And yet, remarkably, in the midst of their harrowing testimonies, a different kind of shock surfaced, their profound disbelief at the unexpected American behavior. Many admitted they had anticipated nothing different from their new liberators. They assumed the GIs would simply treat them as spoils of war, perhaps with even less restraint than the Germans. Instead, they were met with nourishing food, compassionate medical care, and most confounding of all, genuine respect. One French woman, her voice still laced with wonder, later recounted, "When he called me madame, I laughed. I thought it was a cruel joke, another twisted form of torment. But he truly meant it." That breathtaking reversal of all their grim expectations, she realized, was as staggering and disorienting as the freedom itself. For the American soldiers, the brutal confrontation with this vile system stirred a profound tempest of conflicting emotions. Deep pity, searing anger, and even a heavy shame that such systematic cruelty had existed, utterly unbeknownst to them. Some confessed to enduring nightmares long afterward, haunted less by the thunderous gunfire of battle than by the indelible image of those young women sitting quietly on their beds, patiently waiting for what they tragically assumed must inevitably come next. Liberation should have been a moment of unadulterated joy. But here, it felt muted, profoundly tainted by years of suffering so deep it could never be erased by a single compassionate act of kindness. Still, at the very edges of this profound despair, a sliver of dark humor occasionally crept in, not born of disrespect, but as a desperate salve against the overwhelming desolation. One corporal quipped, "Only the Germans could run a brothel like a train station." Another added, "With the same damned punctuality, too." The men chuckled bitterly, a low, guttural sound, and the women, though they didn't understand the specific words, seemed to intuitively sense the absurdity being mocked. Laughter, even in fractured, hesitant bursts, felt like an unexpected act of rebellion against the oppressive system that had so long forced absolute silence upon them. The Americans meticulously documented everything. Photographs were taken, official reports were filed, and diaries were scribbled in haste, filled with raw, unfiltered observations. They wanted irrefutable proof, not only for headquarters, but for themselves, to truly believe that what they had witnessed was horrifyingly real. Some of those haunting images would surface years later, silent, stark witnesses to a truth many would still find agonizingly difficult to confront. Historians would eventually debate the precise scale, the nefarious purpose, the exact numbers. But for the soldiers who discovered it, and for the women who tragically lived through it, the brutal reality was utterly undeniable. As night fell, the camp seemed to sink deeper into shadow, as if the very ground itself were ashamed. The women huddled together, clutching the blankets and rations they had been given, whispering fearfully in half a dozen different languages. The Americans posted guards, not to prevent escape, but to ensure no further intrusion, determined that no more harm would come to these fragile survivors. Yet, beneath the initial, fragile relief, an unanswered, immense question lingered. What came next? Freedom was merely a word, but the world beyond the barbed wire was still profoundly scarred, deeply suspicious, and ominously ready to judge. For some of these women, the harrowing act of leaving the brothel would mean returning not to loving families, but to a chilling silence, to societies often unwilling to hear or acknowledge their devastating stories. A young soldier, barely 20 years old, watched them as the first stars emerged overhead. He had stormed across raging rivers, faced relentless mortar fire, and witnessed comrades fall beside him. But here, amidst these women wrapped in simple wool blankets, he felt more profoundly helpless than he ever had before. "How do you give back a life?" he whispered into the quiet, to no one in particular. The question hung heavy in the vast night, echoing across the silent barracks where the ledgers still lay on the tables. Those meticulous pages recorded transactions, times, and names, but they could never, ever measure what had truly been stolen. And as dawn threatened on the horizon, painting the sky with pale light, the faded red curtain in the doorway fluttered once more, casting its long shadow like a fresh wound across the floor. Behind it lay the undeniable evidence of a system so carefully hidden, so meticulously and coldly run, that only now, at the very end of the war, was it being dragged violently into the light. For the women, liberation had, indeed, arrived, but their fragile belief in it was still only just beginning to take root. The camp gate swung open, a literal threshold, and for the first time in years, the women stepped beyond the grim perimeter of their prison. Yet, this liberation was not greeted with exultant cheers or joyous songs. Instead, it unfolded as a hesitant, trembling procession. Each step they took was imbued with deep suspicion, as if freedom itself might prove to be merely another cruel, deceptive trick. American soldiers guided them gently toward waiting trucks, their hands open, their voices deliberately lowered and soft, but the women's eyes darted ceaselessly from uniform to uniform, instinctively searching for the familiar, terrifying signs of threat. After all, uniforms had, for so long, always signaled imminent danger. One young Ukrainian girl, her hair roughly cropped and uneven from life's treatment, pressed herself tightly against the side of the truck and whispered to a medic through an interpreter, "How much do you pay me?" Her voice was so fragile, so thin, it almost dissolved into the gentle spring air. The medic, visibly baffled and deeply saddened, shook his head. "Nothing," he answered, his voice gentle. "We don't pay. We don't take. You're free." The word free struck her with the force of a stone dropped into deep, still water, sending ripples of disbelief across her gaunt face. She repeated it softly, as if testing its unfamiliar weight, then clutched the bread he offered as though it might, at any moment, simply vanish. For other women, disbelief rapidly morphed into outright panic. A French woman vehemently refused to climb into the waiting vehicle, absolutely certain that another, equally dreadful camp awaited them just beyond the trees. "They always say it is over," she cried out, her voice raw with terror. "But it is never over." A chaplain gently placed his hand on her trembling shoulder, and with painstaking, empathetic calm, assured her that the war was indeed ending, that Paris was free, that she could finally go home. The words, for her, sounded like fanciful fairy tales, impossible fragments of a life she could no longer even begin to imagine. Still, with a profound, almost ritualistic effort, she eventually climbed aboard, her knuckles white with strain around the small, worn rosary she had kept hidden deep within her bodice. The Americans themselves struggled profoundly to process the harrowing scene unfolding before them. They had naively envisioned liberation as a joyous surge of gratitude, a resounding chorus of relief. Instead, they beheld hollow eyes, rigid postures, and tears that carried absolutely no joy. A corporal wrote in his diary that night, his hand steady but his heart heavy. They cried not because they were free, but because they did not believe it. Imagine a freedom so foreign it feels like another prison. His poignant words perfectly captured the strange, crushing weight that pressed down upon this hard-won victory. On the rough road leading out of the compound, the trucks bounced over deep ruts, and the women swayed together in a profound, unsettling silence. One soldier, attempting to ease the palpable tension, pulled out a Hershey bar from his ration kit and broke it carefully into several pieces, handing them down the line. For a lingering moment, suspicion remained etched on their faces. Then a young Polish girl bit into the chocolate, and her face instantly crumpled, not with delight, but with an overwhelming wave of grief. The intense sweetness, so utterly alien after years of bitter broth and deprivation, completely overwhelmed her. She sobbed openly, clutching the tiny piece as if it were a fragile talisman, carrying her back to a lost childhood. Others quickly followed, tasting the sugar and breaking into a mixture of tears, laughter, or both. The soldier quickly looked away, deeply embarrassed by the sheer intensity of their reaction, muttering almost inaudibly, "It's just candy." But it was not just candy. It was tangible proof that gentleness, unbelievably, still existed in the world. The medics who diligently examined the women recorded widespread malnutrition, virulent venereal diseases, multiple pregnancies, and various infections. Yet, what struck them even more profoundly than the raw physical wounds was the deep, ingrained mistrust. One doctor vividly recalled how every gesture, even the simple, kind offering of a warm blanket, was met with intense suspicion until its benign intent could be unequivocally proven. The women flinched instinctively when men approached, braced themselves for harsh orders, and silently awaited inevitable blows. It took agonizing time, hours, then days, for them to slowly, painfully recognize that these Americans were not, in fact, repeating the old, brutal cycle. One survivor would later poignantly write, "When the doctor touched my arm, I closed my eyes, waiting for the pain, but the pain never came. He only checked my pulse. I could not stop trembling." The GIs, many of them barely older than the women themselves, wrestled with a maelstrom of emotions they could not easily articulate. Some openly admitted they felt a profound shame, not for anything they had personally done, but for simply belonging to the same species as the men who had orchestrated such unspeakable cruelty. Others felt fiercely protective, a deep desire to shield these women, not just from bullets and bombs, but from the haunting specter of memory itself. A sergeant from Ohio reportedly voiced a widespread sentiment. "We came here to fight soldiers, but I feel like I should have been here sooner for them." His poignant words were echoed by many of his comrades. A shared, aching sense that victory on the battlefield felt tragically hollow when measured against the immense fragility of the lives they had so belatedly rescued. And yet, even amidst such profound despair, sparks of raw humanity unexpectedly flickered. At one makeshift camp established for the survivors, a group of soldiers patiently taught the liberated women a simple American song. "You are my sunshine." The words were foreign, but the melody, with its tender simplicity, quickly caught on, and soon thin, cracked voices sang in halting, tentative unison. The sound was uneven, often off-key, yet the soldiers clapped along with genuine warmth, and for a brief, transcendent moment, the very air vibrated with something dangerously close to pure joy. One GI later joked, a bitter edge to his voice, "The Nazis might have kept schedules, but they sure didn't keep rhythm." The laughter that followed was brittle but undeniably real, and it startled the women almost as much as the unexpected taste of chocolate had. Still, this newfound liberation, however profound, carried its own deep shadows. Some women recoiled entirely from the very idea of returning home, fearing utter rejection and judgment. A young Polish girl whispered fearfully to a nurse, "If they know where I was, they will call me a traitor." Others clung desperately to their American rescuers, terrified of being abandoned once more. An American chaplain, observing this raw desperation, wrote in his notes, "They cling not to us personally, but to the fragile idea that someone, anyone, might still see them as something more than what they were brutally forced to become." As news of these horrific brothels spread chillingly through the ranks, soldiers began comparing stories from other recently liberated camps. In one Dutch camp, women had fallen to their knees, weeping and kissing the boots of their liberators, only to be gently, respectfully lifted back to their feet. At Buchenwald, one survivor, dazed and disoriented, asked an American soldier if he was truly real or merely a merciful dream sent by God. In each harrowing case, a profound disbelief mingled with a hesitant gratitude, the mind struggling desperately to accept the reality of the safety that the body so desperately craved. By nightfall, the liberated women lay on cots in makeshift field hospitals, wrapped in warm blankets, their hair now washed, their wounds carefully treated. Some, for the very first time in years, slept without the gnawing fear of a door creaking open in the terrifying darkness. Others remained wide awake, staring blankly at the ceiling, straining to listen for footsteps that mercifully never came. Freedom, it seemed, was proving to be as profoundly frightening as captivity itself, if only because it was so utterly unfamiliar. For the Americans, too, this harrowing experience altered something fundamental within them. They had witnessed war's open brutality, its explicit violence, but this was its quiet, insidious cruelty, the deliberate corruption of intimacy itself. One lieutenant confessed in a private letter home, "I thought I knew what we were fighting for. Today, I finally understood." His words carried both an unshakable conviction and a deep, pervasive sorrow, a profound sense that any victory felt less like a triumph when measured against years of systematically stolen human dignity. And yet, the story did not mercifully conclude with the simple offerings of blankets and chocolate. Liberation was, heartbreakingly, only the very first step. And for many of these women, the hardest, most daunting journey still lay ahead. A return to societies often eager to forget, to families that might tragically turn away, and into the indelible memories that would never, ever fade. As dawn slowly crept over the horizon, painting the sky in a pale, fragile gold, the women stirred restlessly under their blankets, some clutching their pieces of bread, others clutching each other. They were alive, yes, but survival now carried with it a new, immense question, one as heavy as the physical chains they had at last left behind. The war had officially ended, but for the women liberated from the camp brothels, the very word peace was heavy, burdened with agonizing contradictions. They had, indeed, stepped beyond the confining wire, received nourishing food, medical bandages, and even hesitant laughter from soldiers who, unbelievably, treated them with dignity. Yet, freedom itself proved far more complicated and elusive than a single open gate. Many were transported by trucks to bustling displaced persons camps, sprawling temporary cities where survivors of ghettos and labor battalions gathered beneath the familiar Red Cross tents. There, amidst the overwhelming chaos of relief efforts and bureaucratic paperwork, their unique stories proved agonizingly difficult to categorize. Prisoners of war could be readily counted, meticulously documented, and eventually exchanged. Political detainees could be easily listed by name. But what official category, what designation could possibly exist for women who had been brutally forced into sexual slavery within a brothel system? Their particular suffering did not fit into existing frameworks, leaving them in a devastating limbo. The stories of these women could not fit neatly into the triumphant columns of liberation. The American soldiers who encountered them in those dire circumstances struggled profoundly too. A chaplain confessed in his official report. He pondered, "We can feed them, clothe them, but how do we begin to explain to the world what unspeakable acts were done?" Their wounds, he noted, were not always visible. Some soldiers carried small, crumpled photographs of the women they had met, carefully tucked into their journals alongside pressed wildflowers, as if mere proof of their existence might lend gravitas to voices history seemed destined to overlook. One young lieutenant, writing home to his wife in Illinois, recounted his encounter with a French woman who wept inconsolably when he addressed her as Mademoiselle. He concluded his letter with a haunting realization. "The war has taught me what cruelty truly means, but she, in her fragility, taught me what kindness, even the smallest gesture, can begin to repair." The women themselves grappled with an agonizing paradox. Within the confines of the brothel, they had been brutally forced to perform intimacy devoid of consent or choice. Outside, as the camps were liberated, their deepest longings were for ordinary love, for the solace of families, for homes where their names would be spoken with gentleness and affection. Yet, the pervasive stigma clung to them like an inescapable shadow. In regions like Poland and Ukraine, whispers of betrayal or collaboration often awaited women who dared to admit what had befallen them. Many chose silence, crafting careful lies about their whereabouts when they returned to their villages. Others sought refuge through immigration, building new lives in America or France, where anonymity offered a fragile kind of sanctuary from judgment. A brave few, decades later, would finally testify publicly, their trembling voices cutting through years of enforced forgetting and societal denial. One such survivor, speaking in the 1990s, articulated a profound truth. When the Americans gave me bread, I initially thought it was mere charity. Only much later did I truly understand it was recognition. It was proof that I was still human. Historians painstakingly pieced these fragmented narratives together. Records irrefutably confirmed the existence of at least 10 major concentration camps that maintained brothels: Auschwitz, Buchenwald, Dachau, and others among them. Documents chillingly revealed quotas for the women, meticulous payment ledgers, and official orders signed in the very same bureaucratic offices where the horrific death transports were systematically organized. Testimonies from survivors painted a picture with unbearable detail. The cloying smell of powder mingled with disinfectant, the constant, paralyzing fear of disease, the ominous sound of boots echoing outside their doors. Numbers were grimly estimated. Between 200 and 500 women were forced into sexual slavery in some individual camps, tallying several thousand in total across the system. But these figures, however staggering, could never fully capture the immeasurable weight of silence carried across decades. For the soldiers who had witnessed the brothels firsthand, memory became both a profound burden and an unexpected moral compass. One medic confessed to recurring nightmares where he offered bread to the women, only for it to crumble into ash in their outstretched hands. Another soldier, interviewed in the 1970s, mused, "You fight a war thinking you'll remember the battles. But what truly haunts me is the image of a girl too scared to eat a simple candy bar." Their invaluable testimonies became an integral part of oral history, serving as stark reminders that liberation was not always a triumphant, straightforward march, but often a fragile, harrowing negotiation between trauma and the tentative rebuilding of trust. And yet, even amidst the immense pain and suffering, profound moments of human transformation occasionally surfaced. Women have been treated as mere property discovered, through small, unexpected gestures, a nascent rebirth of their dignity. A blanket placed gently over their shivering shoulders. A soldier quietly turning his back to afford them a moment of privacy. A chaplain kneeling to pray not for them, but respectfully with them. These acts, which might have seemed trivial to outsiders, struck the survivors with the force of a revelation. They had endured a system where men's hands had only ever taken. Suddenly, they encountered hands that gave, a stark contrast that was, in its own way, even more shocking and affirming than liberation itself. Time, though it could not erase the deep scars, did subtly reshape them. Some survivors eventually married, lovingly raised families, and carried their profound secrets silently, while tucking their own children in a bed with a tenderness they themselves had been cruelly denied. Others, however, never fully escaped the shadow, haunted by chronic disease, infertility, or an enduring sense of shame. In every single case, their legacy was one of survival against an organized, dehumanizing cruelty that had sought to utterly erase them. By enduring, by steadfastly refusing to vanish into oblivion, they defiantly challenged the very machinery that had reduced their lives to mere ledgers and numbers. The world, regrettably, was slow to listen. For decades after the war's conclusion, the existence of concentration camp brothels remained a mere footnote in academic scholarship, an uncomfortable subject often deliberately avoided in official historical narratives. It was only in the late 20th century that survivor testimonies began to surface in wider circulation, compelling scholars and citizens alike to confront the uncomfortable truth that liberation stories often carried profound layers of unacknowledged silence. Some of the women had already passed away by then, their invaluable voices preserved only in fragments painstakingly recorded by dedicated archivists. This tragic delay in recognition deepened their suffering, as though their lives had been doubly erased, first by brutal captivity, then by a collective failure of memory and acknowledgement. Still, persistent traces endured. In museums, artifacts gradually began to appear. A small makeup compact found amidst the rubble of Buchenwald, a chilling ledger from Mauthausen, a faded red curtain salvaged from a barracks door. Visitors would stare at these seemingly ordinary objects with a profound sense of disbelief, struggling to reconcile them with the horrifying reality of systematic sexual exploitation. One historian poignantly remarked, "These items are both utterly ordinary and utterly unbearable. A lipstick tube should not belong in a concentration camp. Yet here it is." Such stark juxtapositions starkly revealed how totalitarian ideology could twist the most intimate, everyday objects into instruments of dehumanizing control. For the Americans who had been young soldiers in 1945, the memory of these encounters remained a quiet, enduring reminder of what victory truly meant. Not the flags raised in triumph, nor the treaties signed by statesmen, but the poignant moment a woman finally dared to eat bread without the crushing weight of fear. They carried those indelible images into old age, often telling their grandchildren not about medals or military glory, but about the profound kindness rediscovered amidst the ruins of cruelty. One veteran, at his funeral, was remembered for a particularly moving observation. "I knew we had truly won the war when I saw a girl put down her shawl and simply smile without being told to." The legacy of those brothels is far more than just a historical footnote. It is a powerful, unsparing mirror. They remind us that systems of oppression thrive not solely through overt violence, but also through the insidious normalization of exploitation. And they profoundly remind us that liberation is never merely an act of breaking physical chains, but fundamentally an act of restoring dignity, agency, and self-worth. The women freed in 1945 were not simply victims. They were powerful survivors who taught the world what it truly means to endure. Their disbelieving reactions to kindness, their tears shed over the simple gifts of chocolate and bread, remain one of the most haunting testaments of the war. And yet, as the decades passed, a crucial question continued to linger. If the Americans had shocked them by offering unexpected compassion, what did that say about the world these women were returning to? Would post-war societies receive them with the same nascent gentleness and understanding, or would they be pushed back into a suffocating silence, their harrowing stories deemed unwelcome? The war had ended with guns falling silent, but for these women, the battle for memory, for recognition, and for their rightful place in history had only just begun.